Thank you very much. I would also like to begin by extending my thanks to the Ministry of the Interior for their very gracious invitation to speak to you today, and also to many of you for taking the time to speak with Liz and myself earlier this week. We spoke with police officers and prosecutors and researchers and government officials and learned a tremendous I'm sorry, this looks like it might be critical. We learned a great deal about some of the challenges you're facing here in Iceland, and some of the opportunities that you may have. Some of the opportunities that you have at the moment. I think this work is enormously important. And I learned yesterday that 1 in 4 women in Iceland, according to a national population survey, that's a random survey of the population, 1 in 4 women in Iceland have experienced rape or attempted rape or another form of sexual violence. So that's 1 in 4 women in this room, 1 in 4 women that you may meet every day. And so it's a problem of significant magnitude. We have very similar figures in Canada. Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that start. Okay, I have elected to speak to you today about some of the challenges that we faced in Canada around using the law to respond to sexual violence. We underwent law reform, major law reform in 1983 to abolish the crime of rape, attempted rape, and indecent assault, and replace those with 3 levels of sexual assault. And feminists were firmly behind that move, and we're finding now that we have unintended consequences of good intentions. And I'm going to argue that the law is highly symbolic, and it's very important, and law reform and legal reform is critically important because some women want to use it. But there are many, many other aspects to a comprehensive societal response to sexual violence. So our law reforms had a number of objectives. We wanted to, first of all, remove the stigma associated with being a rape victim, and we wanted to emphasize the violence associated with that crime. Previously, our law on rape was situated within the portion of the criminal code that dealt with public morals. And so it was under rape reform law, sexual assault was moved into the section dealing with violent crime, so that's very symbolic. We wanted to reduce prejudicial attitudes towards women in the investigation and the prosecution of these cases, and we wanted to encourage women to report. And overall, we wanted to reduce or improve the very high rates of attrition throughout the criminal justice system that Liz had spoken about. So here we are 30 years after law reform, almost, and there's evidence that simply replacing the crime of rape with sexual assault and eliminating the formal expression of bias in the law has not made a real difference in the treatment of sexually assaulted women in the justice system. So the purpose of my talk today is to demonstrate how beliefs about sexuality and gender and the way these play out continue to minimize women's experiences and exonerate violent men and distort public understanding of this crime, and that much more needs to be done to address these areas. So a reform of rape law in Canada came about as the result of 2 major factors. One was feminist lobbying to improve the criminal justice response to these crimes, and the need at the time to bring all laws into compliance with the gender equality provisions of our new Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So prior to 1983, rape was defined as an act of vaginal penetration by a man against a woman who was not his wife. So the law and its application were steeped in gender inequality and rape myths. In addition to explicit immunity for raping marital partners were the following. A successful prosecution required proof that the woman violently resisted and complained at the first opportunity. It was standard practice to question the victim about her sexual history to establish her credibility and her likelihood of lying. Judges were required to warn a jury that it was dangerous to convict if the woman's testimony could not be corroborated by independent evidence. So it was therefore codified in law that rape complainants were prone to fabrication. And this discouraged women from reporting. It made convictions extremely unlikely. So in 1983, the crimes of rape, attempted rape, and indecent assault on a male, indecent assault on a female were abolished and replaced with 3 levels of sexual assault with a gradation based on the level of violence and the severity of the physical injury. Evidentiary rules related to spousal immunity, recent complaint, the need to corroborate the victim's story, and sexual history were eliminated. So we have an important question. Have these legal changes made a difference? Have they met the objective of encouraging reporting, improving the treatment of complainants by police and the courts, and reducing attrition throughout the system? Let's look first at the trends of prevalence of sexual assault over time. We have victimization surveys only every 5 years in Canada. We interview random samples of the population, and they estimate that the annual incidence of sexual assault has been steady. By contrast, this is what police statistics show. So those that are reported to the police and deemed to be credible, and the police are going to proceed with them. There was a small but steady rise in rates of rape and indecent assault prior to 1983, followed by a sharp increase in the new crime of sexual assault up until 1993, when it began to decline. So what's not clear is whether this trend reflects a real rise and fall in the occurrence of sexual assault in the population, changes in the way police respond to or record these crimes, or does it reflect a change in women's reporting? There was a very good evaluation by the Department of Justice in 1992-93, which suggested that after the rise after law reform related to an increased willingness of women to report as a result of law reform and other social changes that occurred simultaneously, such as the expansion and growth in specialized sexual assault units and training for the police. So they attributed it to the fact that the law was successful, more women are reporting. There has not been another evaluation, so we can only speculate as to what that drop means. So it's difficult to test any claims since so few women report to the police, and victimization surveys are conducted too infrequently to establish whether changes in reporting behavior might be the cause. But in all our victimization surveys, fewer than 10% of sexual assaults are reported to the police. So there isn't a great deal of fluctuation in reporting rates according to victim surveys. So if improvements to the justice system response were indeed responsible for the rise in reported sexual assaults prior to 1993, it is indeed feasible that negative experiences with the legal process since that time may have reduced women's willingness to engage with the justice system. Another important view of the justice system response is the way in which police record the crimes that are reported to them. So, first of all, look at how our law defines levels, what we call level 1, 2, and 3 sexual assault. Level 3 is aggravated sexual assaults that result in serious physical injury, what we call wounding, maiming, disfiguring, endangering the life of the victim. Level 2 is defined as sexual assaults where the accused person used a weapon, caused bodily harm that didn't fall into the level 3 category, committed threats to a third person, which may have been a child, so coerced the woman into sex by threatening somebody else, or gang rape kind of situations where they're committed by more than one person. Now, interestingly, level 1 was undefined in the criminal code and has been defined through case law. And we had the rather ridiculous situation in the first 5 years of after law reform where the courts debated what a sexual assault was. And the precedent-setting case was a case in the province of New Brunswick where a woman's breasts were grabbed by a man, and the lower court determined that wasn't a sexual assault because the breasts were secondary sex characteristics like a man's beard. So for 5 years, we debated this, and finally it went to a superior court, and we determined that no, in fact, that was a sexual assault. Now, importantly, I mentioned the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, equality provisions earlier on. This is a gender-neutral law, so it can apply to male victims as well as female victims. But still, female victims make up 98% of all those recorded in police statistics. So, where is rape in all of this? You might reasonably assume, as I always have, that the act of forced penetration, formerly a crime of rape, warrants a charge of at least level 2 due to the bodily harm that results. You would be wrong. It is charged and prosecuted under any of these sections, including level 1, a fact that's not broadly known beyond the legal profession. And in fact, most people assume that level 1 is a slap on the butt by against a barmaid, by a drunk patron, or something like that. In fact, that's what criminology students believe. And it's one of the great frustrations of researchers that we cannot identify rape. And I did not, in fact, realize this until I had a discussion with a judge who was very confused by my assumption that rape couldn't be charged under level 1. So, when we look at how police record sexual assaults over time, may I go back with this? Sorry, complicated. It's important to see how they have recorded these offenses over time according to levels 1, 2, and 3. Now, I only have the bright pink line here is level 1. Levels 2 and 3 I had to put on a different chart because they make up such a very small percentage. In 1983, 88% of all sexual assaults were recorded as level 1. At the end of this timeline, it's 98%. Almost all are now recorded as level 1 offenses. We can see here that levels 2 and 3 have always been small, but they've dropped dramatically. The law is supposed to account for different degrees of severity, yet unless the nature and the severity have changed, and I'm not aware of any evidence that that is the case, these figures suggest that some incidents that previously would have been classified as level 2 or 3 are now treated as level 1 offenses. And there have been some investigations into what makes up these categories, and there was a study of hospital-based services of women who've been sexually assaulted, who compared to police and prosecutor records and found that the expected charge, based on the seriousness of the incident, corresponded to the charges laid in only 40% of cases, and that many cases charged under level 1 sexual assault involved rape, the use of force, and injury to the victim. So the view of sexual assault from the perspective of women victims adds another dimension to this. I've mentioned our victimization surveys. We ask women about their experiences of sexual assault in 2 categories: forced sexual activity and unwanted sexual touching, and these are meant to conform to our criminal code definitions. And on victimization surveys, 20% of women who report sexual assault to those surveys report it under the most serious sexual attacks involving force. In addition, those are more likely to be reported to the police, so we might reasonably expect the higher proportion of level 2 and 3 to be recorded in police statistics. So, what are the implications of this underclassification of sexual assault? It has obvious implications in the treatment of these cases in court, because the maximum sentences are different. Underclassification also has implications for the way this crime is understood by the general public. Statistics legitimated by government sources like police and like Statistics Canada, from where I have drawn these data, influence public perception when levels 2 and 3 are described as very low and dropping, and the vast majority are described as not serious, whether or not they involve rape or weapons, force, injuries, or long-lasting emotional trauma. So one result of law reform, therefore, has been to substantially downgrade the offense, since rape and unwanted sexual touching technically now can occupy the same offense category and can be dealt with under the least serious category as either an indictable offense or as a summary conviction offense. And a summary conviction offense is punishable by a maximum of 18 months imprisonment and rarely receives a prison sentence. Prior to law reform, rape made up 25% of police-recorded sexual offenses, many of which are now portrayed as nonviolent or less serious level 1 offenses. So while the shift from rape to sexual assault was intended to reduce the stigma associated with being a victim of rape and emphasize the violent nature of this crime, feminist legal scholars point out that in degendering the law and replacing rape with a gradation of sexual assault offenses, an important shared social understanding of the meaning and impact of rape for women has been lost. So what then can we attribute the failure of law reform to make a difference? What we've learned is that law reform is not enough. There's evidence that women continue to experience sexual violence against a backdrop of ambiguities and biases about what behaviors constitute sexual assault, what is consent, the level of harm to women, women's culpability and blameworthiness, and social and cultural supports for male sexual aggression. Since the majority of women's experiences of sexual violence fail to conform to stereotypes of so-called real rape, they're often trivialized in society and in law, falling within the realm of, quote, ordinary and thus acceptable events. When women disclose to others they've been sexually assaulted, they're often confronted with skepticism, doubt, and outright blame for provoking or at least not resisting the attack strenuously enough. Reactions from others in the women's social world contain both explicit and implicit messages about how to make sense of what happened. And these reactions have a direct impact on her ability to interpret the experience as a violent act for which she is not responsible. A rich literature coming from many countries documents the widespread acceptance of negative stereotypes about women who complain of sexual assault that are held by criminal justice officials, defense lawyers in particular, juries, and the general public. Law reform and decades of feminist activism has failed to dispel the widely held belief that real rape happens only under very specific circumstances, such as when a woman with no sexual history is assaulted with a stranger, suffers serious physical injury, and immediately runs to the police. Other situations, of course, we know are far more common, where sexually experienced women might be intoxicated or have mental health problems, have previously laid a complaint of sexual assault, or willingly accept a lift home with someone they just met. These fail to qualify in the minds of many people as legitimate victims of sexual violence. Women in these situations are most likely to be suspected of laying a false complaint, as somehow deserving of what happened, and often is just treated as just her word against his. So let me give you a few examples of empirical research into rape myths in the general population. In a survey of Australian adults, 1/3 believe or suspect that women cry rape falsely. Almost a quarter believe or suspect that when a woman says no, she really means yes. And over 40% believe or suspect that rape results from men not being able to control their need for sex. So in other words, a woman leads them on, what does she expect? In a survey of adults in the United Kingdom, similarly large proportions believe a woman is partially or totally responsible for being raped if she behaved in a flirtatious manner, was drunk, was wearing sexy or revealing clothing, or has had many sex partners. Beliefs about these rape myths have been the subject of extensive study by social psychologists, and although they don't always predict behavior, there is evidence that bystanders who hold these beliefs are less likely to be empathetic or to report the incident, are more likely to blame victims and to recommend lenient penalties. Men who score higher on rape-supportive beliefs are more likely to say they would be sexually coercive or violent. Women who hold those beliefs about rape and rape victims are less likely to find their own experiences of sexual violence and less likely to seek help. These myths and biases about women, men, and rape have also been formally and informally entrenched in the administration of the law, and not surprisingly, if such a large proportion of the population holds these beliefs. In fact, there are current texts on criminal investigation that provide evidence of how deeply committed some criminal justice actors are to perpetrating negative and hostile beliefs about women who complain about sexual violence. And here's just one example, and this is a 2002 text that was put together by a criminal profiler in the United States and a retired detective. And they claim that false allegations of sexual assault make up at least 30%, resulting in many falsely charged men. And they've developed what they call a false report index to help investigators weed out false complaints. And they contain the following red flags. So if any of these occurred, then the investigator should be on the alert that it's probably being falsely reported. The woman asked to speak with a female officer. The woman has a drug problem, a history of psychiatric problems, or cries during the interview. The woman has reported a similar crime in the past. The woman mimics stereotypical behavior of rape victims that she's seen on television. Now, that would probably include almost all women who report sexual violence. And there's much more gruesome evidence here of how the recommended way of interviewing sexual assault complainants is closer to what we might think would be appropriate for a homicide suspect than a victim of a crime. So in Canada, despite the best intentions of law reform, the evolution of sexual assault in the Canadian legislature and criminal courts has been one of one step forward and two steps back. While some gains to women's equality rights have been realized through amendments to the criminal code, which I mentioned, many have been systematically eroded through defense counsel tactics and precedent-setting courtroom outcomes. And here I'll just mention specifically the use of sexual history evidence and consent. So even though sexual history evidence is not admissible to support an inference that the complainant is likely to have consented or is likely fabricating, a study commissioned by the Department of Justice found that vague assertions of relevance by defense counsel are enough in most cases to admit sexual history evidence. So it's admitted in many, many cases to demonstrate a motive to lie. In addition, with the door apparently closed on sexual history evidence, at least in theory, defense counsel have successfully gained access to complainants' personal records. Now, by that I mean records from a rape crisis center, records from another counselor, a psychiatrist, or even medical records can now be used in court to demonstrate, to discredit the testimony of victims. So the Supreme Court has determined that judges should err on the side of producing these records if there's any doubt about their likely relevance. Using the personal records to create the appearance of faulty memories or motives to lie has now become a key mechanism for attacking sexual assault complainants in court. The majority of sexual assault trials hinge on the credibility of women as a group and the believability of the complainant when she says she did not consent. So consent is the critical factor in most criminal trials. The criminal code now requires the accused take reasonable steps to ensure the victim was consenting. So we have consent provisions in our criminal code. And it lists situations that don't constitute consent. For example, the accused cannot use the defense that he mistakenly believed the victim was consenting when the belief arose out of his intoxication, what we call recklessness or willful blindness, or where he failed to take reasonable steps to determine consent. So it has to be an active determining of consent. Still, sexual assault is like no other crime in the efforts made to attack the victim's credibility and question the truthfulness of her complaint. Despite law reform, defense counsel continues to use tactics that legally construct rape victims as unreliable and unbelievable. Now, here's a quote from one of our most active criminal defense lawyers in Ottawa, where I live. And this was a speech to the Canadian Bar Association. And he laid out his strategy for ensuring that sexual assault charges were dismissed before trial. We have something called a preliminary hearing where they determine whether something can go to trial. You have to go in there as a defense counsel and whack the complainant. This has come known as whack the complainant. Whack the complainant hard at the preliminary. You have to do your research, do your preparation, put together your contradictions, get all the medical evidence, get the child welfare records, and you've got to attack the complainant with all you've got so that he or she will say, I am not coming back in front of 12 good citizens and repeat this, excuse my language, repeat this bullshit story that I've just told the judge. To make every effort to discredit victims, he advocates hiring a private investigator, obtaining psychiatric records, hospital records, criminal records of all witnesses, records of victims' prior allegations of sexual assault, documents from child custody and divorce proceedings, and evidence of prior drug or alcohol abuse. Now, these are calculated, blatant attacks on sexual assault complainants by defense counsel. Thank you. It is thus quite easy for defense counsel to tap into rape myths and stereotypes about sexual assault complainants and to allow these to overshadow the facts of the case. Victims of sexual violence are still clearly being held to a standard that does not apply in any other crime. Rape myths serve a number of important purposes, and to quote one legal scholar, these myths help men individually and as a class to rationalize their sexual abuses or to distinguish their own natural sexual aggression or ordinary sexual opportunism from the really culpable and injurious kind practiced by those aberrant, truly violent, genuinely scary men the criminal law is meant to isolate and jail. In other words, it helps us to picture the rapist as being a scary stranger and not the man next door. Okay, I only have a couple of minutes left, so I'll just end with talking about attrition through the justice system. I too have borrowed this idea from Australia, turned it the other way around. What we see on the bottom here is, on the basis of our crime victimization survey, about 460,000 women experience sexual violence, sexual assault within 1 year. Only about 15,000 report to the police. Now, police, when they investigate, can unfound a crime. And unfounding means, technically, the instructions that are given to them is that they investigate and determine a crime did not happen. Overall, nationally, the rate of unfounding of sexual assaults is 16%, which is twice as high as for other assaults. In Ottawa, where I come from, it's 30%. And I'm about to begin a research study with the Ottawa Police to try to untangle why the unfounding rate is so high in our city. But as we go up to the top, where we get convictions of only 1,406, we can calculate that as a 0.3% conviction rate. So in other words, we have an attrition rate of 99.7%. Now, if we take a more conservative view and we only look at the sexual assaults on the first row, which are the more serious ones, attacks with force, 20% of those, our conviction rate rises to 1.6%. So it would take dramatic changes in women's willingness to report these assaults to the police, or a concerted effort to alter current practices and defense counsel tactics in particular to improve the dismal rate of attrition and to address what amounts to impunity for sexually violent men in Canada. So in conclusion, here we are 30 years later. 30 years ago, lawmakers and equality-seeking groups, like women's groups, were optimistic that by reforming the criminal law, laws that were prejudicial towards women, procedural law, that rape myths and biases could be eliminated, women would be encouraged to come forward, and rates of attrition would be reduced. It's clear that rape law reform and efforts to raise awareness and challenging widespread discriminatory stereotypes have not resulted in women's improvements to come forward, nor in prosecution rates. This suggests that while law reform can eliminate the formal expression of rape myths, more is needed to alter biases and stereotypes. And we're now using this kind of knowledge to build prevention strategies that focus on young people and issues related to consent, and engaging men in promoting positive forms of masculinity that don't depend on abuses of women. So men in North America are taking a real leadership role in terms of challenging dominant forms of violence against women, dominant forms of masculinity that endorse violence against women. So my final words to you would be improving the criminal justice system is really important, and keep up your hard work on that. Context is equally important. That I think it's your ideas about incorporating research into your strategy are really important. A comprehensive response has to incorporate identifying the context in which criminal or sexual violence occurs and how that might be contributing to the response of the justice system. Thank you.